Welcome to the Pro Politics Podcast. I'm Zac McCrary. I've been working in politics for the better part of 2 decades, but at heart, I'm a political junkie who wants to talk to interesting people involved in politics. Today, I'm joined by Debbie Cox Bultan, Executive Director and co-founder of NewDEAL, a network that connects and promotes state and local Democratic leaders from across the country with some of their prominent alumni, including 15 members of Congress, names like Stacey Abrams, Pete Buttigieg, Cory Booker, and dozens of Democratic officials at all levels from all 50 states. In this conversation, we talk Debbie's path to politics, her early days managing campaigns, working at big political institutions, helping to start NewDEAL, and the work they're doing ahead of the 2024 election cycle and beyond. Debbie Cox Bultan, tell me a bit about how you grew up.
I grew up in Sacramento, California, middle class parents in a pretty stable family that I had a great childhood, really, honestly. Interestingly, not particularly political, though, or not, connected or anything like that. Very stable, very strong on things like responsibility. They were definitely people who told me that you needed to vote, that your bond was your word. One of my favorite things my dad always says, and I try to say it to my kids now, it's any job worth doing is worth doing well. So kind of, just really we're very grounded, frankly, actually, raised by two very nice people who treated me and my brother very well and gave us every opportunity and always told us we could do and be anything we wanted to be, which I appreciate now. As you get older, you realize not everybody had that kind of stability and that rock under them. And I feel like for me, my whole career and my whole professional life was built on, kind of that foundation, frankly.
And so you didn't really grow up in a political family. So what are some of your own earlier political memories whenever it started to get through to you? Was there a candidate or a campaign, a cause that captured your attention at a younger age?
Yeah. You know what's so funny? So I don't remember this actually, but I have been told that I had a friend in high school whose father ran for assembly in California, and he was a pretty right-wing Republican. Actually, but I remember apparently I had his, even though I was not that even from a very young age, but had his lawn sign up in my room apparently, and so I don't really remember that. But apparently that was I was very taken by that. And so for me, the story I tell myself, tell other people is what happened to me in my political journey was that I had been pretty active in my church growing up, and the thing that I loved about my church was the service aspect of church, was the going to food shelters or the soup kitchens to help. I remember we did a hunger strike one time, and got to talk on the media about why we were doing that. And all of those things where you felt like you were advocating for people and making a difference. And when I got to college, I kind of fell away from the church largely, but I was so sad that it was like, because to me, that was the place where those things happened, where you went to help people. And so when I was in college, I ended up finding my way from my original major of psychology, I think, to political science and English. Through my poli-sci work, I ended up, like so many people do, with a Capitol Hill internship in DC. And I got there and like my mind was blown. I was like, oh my gosh, there are all these people that get up every day and think about how to, on both sides of the aisle, frankly, and this was now 30 years ago plus, but they got up every day thinking about how to make the world a better place. And that was it. Like I was there. I was like, I didn't know you could do that in a different way than the church. I'm all in, and I didn't know what that was going to look like. And I certainly didn't know where my career was going to take me, but I knew that it was going to be politics or government as a way to really be able to give back and make a difference. And I think that even 30 years later, despite all the craziness, which I'm sure we can talk about, but like, I still believe that the vast majority of people get into this business for that reason. And I think that it's so important that we honor that and that we celebrate that.
And so you're a college kid who's not all that politically attuned to start of this. So as you're on Capitol Hill, even if doing, very entry level work, obviously, but what made an impression on you, the memories you have that has stuck with you here 30 plus years after the fact?
Yeah. So I worked when I went to DC, I worked for Congressman Vic Facio. He was the adjacent congressman from where I lived in Sacramento. And I was able to do some really cool things, actually. When I started, I was doing like entry level stuff that everybody does, answering the phones. And I have this very vivid memory of actually getting to answer a letter for him from somebody about asking him what his favorite book was. I had to go talk to the Congress. They gave me like 5 minutes to talk to the congressman and find out what it was and why
what was his favorite book? Do you recall that?
I do. It was Where a Red Fern Grows. And I'd read it, like everybody had, and there was something special just about that kind of very wholesome, very earnest, and the fact I did actually, it struck me that like I got to go ask him and ask him why, right? I didn't like, it wasn't like just go make something up, right? Which I thought was kind of lovely.
Hmm.
But then I got into, doing some of the other stuff that was more caucus building. I helped create the first like database of all of the contact information for all the members in the caucus. And it just felt meaningful, right? Frankly, it just the conversations that were happening where we were doing press clips and keeping track of things and figuring out what was working on the ground and, getting to be in hearings where he was speaking about whatever it was. He did a lot on water policy and other stuff. It just was like, I just felt like it was one of those things that there was like a parallel universe existed that I had no idea existed, which sounds so Pollyannish, but it's like, oh my gosh, there are really people who are sitting here having honest debates about what the right way to help people is. At one point, I actually asked my boss at Vic Facio's office. I think I was a junior in college, and I was like, I think I love this so much. I just don't want to leave. Like, I think I'm going to drop out of school. He's like, just go back, finish your degree, and then you'll you'll find your way back again. But I was just so taken by the whole thing, and I really like never kind of lost that enthusiasm for this work.
Your eureka moment there as a Hill intern. When and how do you then get your foot in the door working in politics? What is the path to actually working in politics in a professional way?
Yeah. So I graduated from college in 1991, in the middle of a recession. It was very hard to get jobs. So like a lot of my peers, I volunteered. So I had gone to school in Santa Barbara, UC Santa Barbara, and then moved up to San Francisco. Volunteered while I waited tables at night for the Barbara Boxer campaign in 1992. To put in the work that way, I ended up getting hired by a fundraising professional that was doing a number of different clients and got my start as a political fundraiser. Worked for people like Cleve Jones in San Francisco, the guy who did the AIDS quilt. Really exciting and interesting work. And then ultimately found my way into campaign management and did a little bit of that for a couple different, or both. I worked on a statewide campaign, and I for governor, and then I managed a state senate race. At the ripe old age of 23 or whatever it was, and then took a break. And really what happened is a friend of mine called me. I had actually gone to Europe to take a little break and travel around Europe like one does when they are in their early 20s sometimes. I think when I was there, in Europe, I called home to check in, and they said, "So your friend's calling you, and she's saying that she's working at the Democratic Leadership Council, and they have an open position, and you should come home and come work with her." And I did that. I took what I thought was going to be a temporary job at the DLC when I was about 24, and I stayed for 15 years and did all kinds of work there.
Let me ask a little bit more about your time as a sort of working campaign manager. How did you approach running campaigns that might have been a little different than others? What made a campaign you were working for or running? What did you bring to it that made it a little unique?
Yeah. Well, you know what I love? I mean, what I loved about running campaigns, and I actually love to hire people who work on campaigns now. I like to hire two kinds of people who work on campaigns or people who wait tables, because both of them have this similarity between, this idea if you've ever waited tables of being in the weeds and finding your way out, but still having to remain pleasant and calm and resourceful and and get the job done. I kind of feel about campaigns as well. So, what I loved about campaigns is probably what I informed my work as, ultimately CEO and executive director for a number of organizations, which is that I brought a service element to it, I guess. And so I've always thought of my job as being the person who my job was to make everybody else be able to do their job well, right? And that was kind of has still been my organizing principle, if you will, for work I've been doing my whole career. It's this idea that if you've got the big vision and you can try to help set strategy in a way that brings everybody together, that tries to move the ball forward with everybody on the same page, rowing in the same direction, if you will, and then make sure they have the tools and the resources they need to do their job well. And so that's kind of the way I approached being a campaign manager, and it's really the way I've approached later in life, an executive director, or today a CEO of an organization.
And you mentioned how you sort of accidentally got involved at the DLC at a time when you were still looking for exactly what your path would look like working in politics. And I know you're not a founding member of the DLC by any means, but you were there 15 years or so. Can you just give a little bit of background about the role that the DLC played in our politics for quite some time, for a good 20 years, helping to elect a Democratic president, and then it sort of faded away? Can you tell the story from your perspective of the
Yeah.
DLC?
Yeah, I mean, I still remain so grateful that I found my way to the DLC, because I I like to say that I grew up there. I literally started there when I was 24 and left there when I was whatever, close to 40. The DLC was Democratic Leadership Council is what it stood for, was really had a massive impact on our party and our country. So, they were founded right after the Mondale debacle when Mondale lost 49 of 50 states. They said something's broken with a Democratic brand. Nobody wants to buy it. We've got to reinvigorate the Democratic brand. And they did so over a number of years, very systematically looking at what our deficits were, what our vulnerabilities were, things, and hit on a number of things. At the time, the Democratic Party was really kind of this loose coalition of interest groups competing for dominance. And so, they looked at things like the fact that there was more written in the in the Democratic platform at the time when they were founded in the 80s on, criminals' rights than victims' rights. They looked at the fact that there was a lack of talk about responsibility, individual responsibility. They talked about trying to solve problems. And it really, it spoke to me in a way. They, of course, were very famous for two things, many things, but two in particular. One, this framing that they did of opportunity, responsibility, and community as the defining principles and values of the Democratic Party that I think spoke to the majority of Americans, frankly. And then, of course, Bill Clinton became chair of the DLC right before he ran for president. And so when he was elected president, a lot of what he did at the DLC as chair, going around the country, finding things that were working, that were different ways of doing things from the Democratic Party. So things like national service and community policing and welfare reform and charter schools, and a lot of things that became his national service, a lot of things that became his agenda items were developed as he was chair of the DLC. So as he elevated into, became president, the DLC really had a huge impact in moving the party in that direction. And for me, what I learned at the DLC, I really found my home when I got to the DLC. I'd always been a little bit of a different kind of Democrat, and I was in campaigns in California, and somebody would say, well, we should do this. And I would say, well, why are we doing it? What is the purpose? Or is that working, right? Is that, do we agree with this policy, but is that policy actually delivering what we said it's going to deliver? And so what I found at the DLC when I got there was another group of people who were thinking about how to modernize progressive politics for a new era, that were kind of looking at the world as it was today, and it was going to be, not as the world as it was. And that's, again, kind of animated my personal politics, and then the work that I've done ever since, very proudly, in kind of this center left moderate Democrat space. I believe that's where the country is, and I believe that's where the party should be. I count myself with New Deal as, one of the DLC was a long time ago. A lot of maybe your listeners will, but a lot of people don't know what the DLC was, so we don't make it front and center. But for me personally, my evolution from the DLC to the New Deal is very seamless in my mind, which is, we're now one of the successor organizations in the sense of the people who are kind of working in that center left space to make sure that progressive politics can be modernized for the 21st century. And so I feel like in many ways the DLC's work continues just through other organizations.
I have a previous episode with former Governor Chuck Robb, who was one of the
Yes.
founders of the DLC in the mid 80s, one of the faces of the DLC in that era, that if people want to hear more about the forming, those early days of the DLC, the interview with Chuck Robb touches on that. Let me ask you just one more DLC question. It's actually less about the DLC, but just more demystifying what some of this work at organizations, national political organizations, look like. One of your specific roles, when you mention a title like president, executive director, most people probably have a sense of what that may look like. It could be wrong, but they could probably at least envision what that looks like. If it's finance director, press, communications, they probably have a sense of, okay, well, I have a general idea of what that looks like. A title that I think is somewhat more opaque is the title of political director, national political director. You were national political director at the DLC. Can you demystify that? What does that look like?
Yeah, well, I can tell you what I did for the DLC. I will say that the national political director role probably depends very largely on this type of organization you are in. So if you are in a national organization that does campaigns, for example, the political director role may look very different than my role at the DLC. So at the DLC, we didn't do campaigns or elections. So what my role was really about going out around the country and finding partners, and particularly elected officials that were like-minded, or other organizations that were like-minded, both how we could partner with them, but also what we could learn from them to inform our own messaging and work and all of that stuff. I mean, clearly, like I said, if you're working at an organization that does campaigns, a political director job is going to look a lot different, where you're identifying races that you think are winnable, or you're figuring out how you can make the most impact to win a race and things like that. So political director probably for the DLC is somewhat of a misnomer, but it really is that kind of, looking national political director, meaning that I was working around the country to work with elected officials or other groups on the ground.
And actually, maybe just one more DLC question, just for historical reference. What is sort of the last best success story of the DLC? I mean, it starts Clinton winning 92, 96 are big pieces of it. I'm sure there's multiple pieces along the timeline. But what do you look back on as for an organization that I believe dissipated in 2011, 2012, something like that in that era? What do you think of as maybe the last best when the last place the DLC was operating how it should have and was having some real by God influence on the
Yeah.
party?
Well, I mean, there's so many successes. I'll take the opportunity to tout a couple before I answer your question, which is there were so many policy success stories of the DLC. I mean, really, if you think about stuff that is absolutely just Democratic doctrine now, was not before the DLC existed. So whether it was things like national service, which I'm a massive proponent of, or the earned income tax credit, or I mean, so many examples of things that we kind of just take for granted are part of the Democratic Party's ethos now, really were brought to the table and pushed for by the DLC. So they have a lot to be proud of. We have a lot to be proud of. But you know what? But the answer I give you to the question is possibly slightly self-serving, but is something that the DLC didn't get a lot of attention for actually was some of the stuff that I was very proud to work on when I was there, which was building a national network of elected officials who governed in kind of the Clinton-esque way, which was this idea of not being wedded to particular orthodoxies of the Democratic Party, but taking the values that animate the Democratic Party and trying to find new solutions. And so, when I think back to all the people that we were working with at the state and local level, then people that went on to be names that your listeners will know, like Janet Napolitano when she was Attorney General, or Tom Vilsack, or Kathleen Sebelius, or so many people who we were working with when they were either statewide office holders or in state legislatures on this kind of national network of like-minded leaders. Those people all went on to become cabinet secretaries and governors, and so I think that that's something that the DLC doesn't get a lot of credit for, but it was super exciting and super important for a generation of leaders in this country.
And in the post DLC era, I know you have your fingerprints on it, but what led to the start of the group you helped found that you're currently the CEO of, known as NewDEAL?
News NewDEAL, YAP, which stands for New Deal, deal standing for Developing Exceptional American Leaders. And in many ways, it really does have a similar idea. The founding of it, Helen Milby, who was the co-founder and really visionary behind New Deal, in large part, the idea was to have a pipeline of folks who she works very closely with the New Democrats coalition in Congress. So that was one avenue, was as people were coming up the ranks and running for Congress, right? Did we know who they were, or we were helping them before they became, congressional candidates? That's borne out as we have, as we founded New Deal, the idea was to go out and identify rising, thoughtful, innovative, and impactful leaders around the country who were doing great things as they governed, but also wanted to stay in public service and rise up the ranks. And so we wanted to keep the group at about 200, which we still do 14 years later now, and invest in them on the governing side of things, idea generation, network building, some skill building, but really just provide a home for them of people who kind of think like they do and trying to solve problems. And so while it has in some ways become a pipeline a little bit to the New Democrat coalition, like I said, I think we have now 12 or 13 members of Congress who are former New Deal leaders, and another 10 or so running for Congress in this cycle. We've also have people like Josh Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania, and Josh Stein, who's currently running in North Carolina. We have other Pete Buttigieg, of course, people will know, came through the New Deal as mayor and is now Secretary of Transportation. But the idea is that, that state and local leaders are doing really important things where they live. And I think that's actually only become more true over my 30 years of working in politics, as things have continued to devolve down to the state and local level. But then as they were doing those really important things and making an impact where they live, they were also gaining the skills and the credibility and the platform to be able to run for higher office. And so that was the idea, is that we would support them and elevate their voices and make them part of the conversation nationally. And that's what we continue to try to do today.
And you work for Democrats, obviously, but Democrats that sort of fit within a pretty broad spectrum of the party. But how do you think about the values that you're looking for the leaders that you want to promote and network with and join and be a part of? Who are you looking for? What are you looking for as you're building out your leaders?
Yeah, so we have three kind of general criteria that we're looking for. We're looking for people who the terminology we have used has been pro-growth progressive, but really I think what we're talking about is, center left leaders, people who are working on really focusing on solutions, kind of consensus building, people who are trying to get stuff done. So, one of the ways we look for people is that we're looking for folks like we can point to a policy that they have, whether it's something that they're working on education reform or on climate change or on anything that's kind of in our very broad spectrum of issues that we work on that is largely about economic opportunity, very broadly defined. And then we've added democracy since in recent years. It just feels like that's a foundational thing that we all need to be working on. So we go out and identify people. We get thousands of nominations. We've had thousands of nominations. We do 2 new classes a year. So we're looking for that kind of people who are impactful, kind of have a temperament around problem solving and kind of not flame throwing, but again are kind of looking for common sense type of solutions. And then people who are rising. So people who we talk to a lot of people on the ground and ask if they are, widely seen as somebody who's going to, have a future in politics, people who we think want to stay in public service. So we take all that kind of mix and we take all the nominees we get, and then we try to create really diverse classes in all senses of that word. People of level of government, we are everything below the level of governor. So we have statewide office holders, we have state legislators, mayors, county and city officials, even down to school board members, and then we want geographic diversity, gender, race, all of the other stuff to make sure we've got a really good reflection. And the fun part is we have people from, blue, red, purple states. We have people from my home state of California. We have people from coal country, Kentucky. And, but they all kind of have that common vision about being willing to experiment, being willing to try to put solutions first. And so it's a really dynamic group of people who are really getting a lot of exciting stuff done.
And perhaps take someone like a Pete Buttigieg, or maybe there's a better example, whoever comes to mind for you, but take someone and walk through the role that your group New Deal has played in the rise of a smart, young, ambitious elected official. What does that look like?
Yeah, well, I mean, Secretary Pete's a great example of somebody who was very active when he was a mayor. We invited him to join pretty early in his tenure. He had been nominated by a number of people who were either active in, I think we originally found him actually through people who were active in kind of the military service groups, right? Because of his military affiliation, right? He was in the National Guard, as people will know, and even served overseas when he was mayor. People probably know about him. So he was obviously he's a generational talent. So he had all kinds of cool stuff happening in South Bend. We worked with him on some of the stuff he was doing around smart cities. He had smart sewer systems. I mean, all kind of like in the weeds, nerdy policy stuff, but we're really about making government work better. So he was a very regular, as many of our leaders are, attendee at our conferences where we would bring people together and sit around tables and share ideas on climate change or on smart cities or on education or whatever it was, and highlight his work nationally. And then, obviously for him, his decision to run for party chair, Democratic National Committee party chair, which is having that national network he had met, not just through us, of course, but certainly the New Deal was one of I'm sure one of the groups that he worked with very closely that exposed him to and helped him build relationships with other elected officials around the country, with other thought leaders, with other like-minded thinkers in the philanthropy and the nonprofit world and the think tank world. All kind of helps, leaders as they are on the rise. I mean, we have another example that pops to mind is the mayor of Lincoln, Nebraska, who's a great New Deal leader, phenomenal woman, who we met and worked with. And this is true of many of our leaders. Actually, 1 in 4 New Deal leaders have risen to higher office after joining New Deal. So these are not isolated incidents, but, she was a city councilwoman, still is very active, but active with New Deal. And for her, meeting some of the other mayors, even though she was a city council member, and getting to know some of those mayors from Louisville and Salt Lake City and other places, helped her think about what she would do as mayor, right? Of Lincoln, of giving her exposure to other ideas of other people who were successful being mayors. And so I think it, gave her the confidence and not just the confidence, but the ideas and the knowledge that she could do it, right? And it was certainly a factor in her deciding to run for mayor. So I mean, that's not, like I said, that's not an isolated incident. That's very typical of the kind of exposure people get that you wouldn't get on your own as a city councilwoman from Lincoln, Nebraska, to have this kind of exposure to this national network of other elected thought leaders and other people who can help her succeed. And that's what we try to bring to New Deal leaders.
And tell me about standing up a new organization. What goes into that? What does that look like? What surprised you about that?
I've done this a couple times now, actually. It feels like a little niche. It's just is starting new organizations, but it's, I think that for me, I have a lot of patience, which is, I think, is a good quality to have when you're starting an organization. Some people, I knew that I've been here for 14 years, 15 years now, just like I was at the DLC. So I feel like I'm someone who's happy to have some longevity somewhere to see it all the way through. I think that's helpful. But when we started up, there's a lot that goes into it. Is like you have a vague idea of how what you want to accomplish, but it's really like putting those processes in place. Like, what does this mean? Are we going to, we had everything I just told you were decisions, right? To decide to have classes, to decide to, who you were going to target, to decide what you were going to do with them once they were in office, when a New Deal leader. It's evolved over time. What started out as a very loose group of people that met a couple times a year. We now have ongoing working groups on a boatload of different topics, and so it's very much evolved over the years. The exciting thing about building something from scratch is, like, you just kind of have to make some decisions and go for it. And you don't have a lot of bureaucracy to telling no, you can't do that, or you can't do this. I mean, obviously I report to a board, but you have a lot of leeway, and it's a very creative endeavor to basically say, okay, let's try this and see how this works. Okay, if that's not working, let's try something different. But really, I think that probably the most helpful quality of being successful, in my experience, is just kind of having that tenacity and that patience to see it through, and to just take. I mean, I tell people all the time, it's like baby steps, right? You just basically say, here, the goalpost is going to be here. We're going to take this many steps to get to that goalpost. But now that we've reached that goalpost, we're going to put more steps in it to reach the next one. And you just have to kind of be pretty methodical about it. But it's been, I mean, honestly, like the joy of my career to build this organization, to be part of it, and to work with so many phenomenal leaders across the country, and who give me hope every day. I get asked all the time by friends and other people who aren't in politics, like, I can't believe how do you do that? It's all cynical, and everybody that's in that is in it for the wrong reasons. And I'm just like, that's not my experience. Everybody I talk to every day is out there trying to make the world a better place. And we are picky about who we invite to join. I'm not saying this is everybody, but we have way more nominees that would be good New Deal leaders than we have space for. So I have a lot of hope. I just think we've got to kind of change the conversation about elected officials and governance, and try to kind of restore some faith and positivity around those things, because it's hurting us as a country.
And in your role as executive director, CEO, being very hands-on in running the organization, you have to wear a lot of hats. I'm sure a lot of different hats. It looks different on a given day. What is a role that maybe didn't come as natural to you, something that was a little more challenging, a little outside of your wheelhouse, your comfort zone, that you had to figure out, okay, how do I tackle this? And then how did you go about adding new tools to your skill set? Is that a fair question?
It's an absolutely fair question. It's a good question. It's a timely question, actually. So I would say that coming into when we started building this, I had a number of roles that kind of largely fell into the seat. Well, I've been a fundraiser, right? That's an important skill to have if you're starting a new organization. So I'd grown up as a fundraiser. I'd also grown up as a chief of staff and COO at various organizations. So I was very operational. I knew how to fundraise. So that's probably why I went to the things I did when you asked me the last question about processes and other things. But as New Deal has evolved over time, my role is evolving, and it continues to evolve. We just hired, after 12, 13 years, a chief of staff at our organization who over the last several months has taken a lot of the day-to-day off my plate, because really what the New Deal needs from me right now is to help us raise our visibility, creating more strategic partnerships so we can grow even more, and we can leverage the work that we do and reach more people through those types of partnerships. So I did a little bit of press work when I was on the campaigns, but that's never been my strong suit. I've always kind of been a behind the scenes person. And so the evolution in my own life and my own career of being the principal of an organization and not the top staff person, and being comfortable being out there and being vulnerable and speaking to press, and more relatively over the last couple of years, new to me. And I'm enjoying it, but it's definitely took some time to have the confidence and the knowledge that this was what was required of me, and I had to step up the plate and do it.
And we're talking in May of 2024, and your group is not one that's hyperactive in individual races necessarily, so it's a little different than some party committees or issue advocacy groups. But what are some of your goals for New Deal for the 2024 elections? In your mind, what will determine if this is a successful cycle for New Deal?
Yeah, you're right. We don't work in individual elections or even in the electoral cycle generally, but we're doing a handful of things. One, we're obviously watching the races that we care. We have a lot of, as I mentioned already, the number of members of people who are running for Congress out of New Deal. We have 4 people running for governor around the country. We have a couple other key races like the Attorney General nominee in Pennsylvania as a New Deal leader, Eugene De Pasquale. We're watching a primary upcoming with a New Deal leader for the Secretary of State role there, Tobias Reed. So we're clearly watching and paying attention to the New Dealers who are running for higher office around the country. But there's a couple things that we're doing that hopefully will help more generally. We released last November in concert with the New Democrat Coalition a freedom agenda to tell people how we think Democrats should be successful in talking about some of the issues that are at play this cycle. So that freedom agenda, talks about thinking about reframing a lot of the issues that we are talking about out on the trail and just generally in terms of governance in a freedom frame. I mean, I think I'm so tired of Republicans owning the word freedom, and particularly in a time when absolutely, if you look at their agenda, it is an anti-freedom agenda. Everything from reproductive choice and book banning, and some of the other cultural wedge issues, to democracy, obviously, and taking rights away from people. So we put together this whole agenda, not just around, what people think of when they think of freedom on the Democratic side, like things like choice, reproductive choice, but also, the freedom for a good education, the freedom to free of gun violence, the freedom to be, to have a pathway to a good job, as well as freedom of democracy and for your vote to count. So we're doing things like that. We've got the freedom agenda out there. We have a democracy working group through the New Deal Forum, which is co-chaired by a couple secretaries of state, Adrian Fontes in Arizona and Jocelyn Benson in Michigan. And that group has put out a democracy playbook a year ago, February, with about 40 ideas that state and local leaders could do to help protect the integrity of our elections, to expand the access to voting, as well as kind of longer term thinking about civic engagement. And so as we are about 6 months out from the election now, now's past the time where you're probably going to get new legislation through, but we're working with leaders around the country on things like, where are you going to put drop boxes? How are you going to protect poll workers? We just released a whole report on the intersection of AI and elections and what leaders can do to prepare for what is inevitably probably going to be some really crazy AI interference in our campaign. So we've got a number of initiatives going on around the election, but I feel like this is it. This is the most consequential election in our lifetime, even though we say it all the time. I think we cried wolf too many times because this is really it. And so we're going to be doing everything we can to try to ensure a free and fair election and a successful one, frankly.
You touched on it a bit, but I also know you've done some work and research on the issue of abortion, on reproductive rights. What can you say about that? What insights do you have on that front that maybe would be new information to folks?
Yeah. So we just did I mentioned a couple of times that we do a couple big convenings with our leaders, and we just had our spring summit a couple weeks ago in Arizona. When we picked it a year ago, we did not know that we would be there the week after the draconian Supreme Court case, reverting us back to 1864. So we did, leading up into that election, we did a poll both nationally and in Arizona to talk about issues like freedom, like democracy, and to also ask people what they wanted in their leaders. And so on the choice issue specifically, I was really heartened to see, we asked people about when they thought about freedom, what did they want their government to do? And overwhelmingly, nationally, but also in Arizona, among really all groups, including Latino voters, which I think sometimes, people assume are more conservative and, not pro-choice. That's not what we found in this poll. So in Arizona specifically, I don't have the numbers, right in front of me, but they're, good majority in the 60s of people wanting government to protect reproductive rights when they think about freedom. We polled a lot of things like about keeping people safe, about providing opportunities to jobs, and choice. And so across the board, it was nice to see that people see that government has a role to play in their lives and believes that government has an important role to play. But on choice specifically, it's clearly a winning issue for Democrats really in swing districts as well. And so, of course, that's why you're seeing all the Republicans scamper back from saying that they were for that crazy law, and actually then even finding the Republicans to repeal it. But of course, that's only gone back to a 15-week ban, so it's things are not good in Arizona yet. So hopefully, with their constitutional amendment in November, they'll have a chance to make their voices heard, like so many other states have happened in the last couple election cycles.
What advice, I'm sure you're asked frequently, but what advice do you find yourself giving to the next generation of people who want to work in politics? Maybe somebody early in their careers volunteered for a campaign or two. Practical things. What do you think that person should be doing? How should they be thinking to prepare for a successful career in politics?
Yeah, one thing that I like to tell people is like find out what you're passionate about, right? I mean, getting in politics is a big amorphous concept, right? So I have been struck as I've talked to elected officials, so many of them tell me a story, and it's not the same story, but it's a story about this happened to me. I saw this in my neighborhood and I wanted to fix it. I care passionately about this issue, whether, again, then an issue can change. But so I feel like, for people who I'm always a little leery of someone who's like, I mean, I love that they want to go into politics generally, but like if they want to run for office, I'm talking about if you want to run for office, if you want to just work in politics, good for you, come do it, call me, but if you want to run for office, my question is, what is it that you're passionate about? What is it that you want to do when you're in office? Because so many people think about elections kind of being the end goal, right? That if we just elect the right people, everything will be fine. I mean, the whole New Deal is really premised on the fact that actually the election is just the beginning. The hard part begins when you get into office and you have to govern. I tell people to kind of, to learn what they can to, a lot of organizations and or cities or states, or whatever, have programs where you can go in and shadow or go in and volunteer, like, find out what you can, learn what you can, and find out what you're passionate about and what you want to bring to the table. I actually think that's also good politics, right? If you can articulate, for every elected official knows that you have to be able to answer the question, why are you running, right? And so, I think you really need an actual answer to that question. You need to know what you believe in your heart.
Focusing in on yourself now, what is the most unusual work habit you have? Something that's maybe a little different, but works for you. What is your strangest successful work habit?
Oh, wow. That's an interesting question. Well, I'll tell you one that my younger staff makes them crazy, which is I have to have, and no, we're only on audio, so no one else is going to see this, but I'm going to show you my really crazy pen and notebook,
Old-fashioned
which
sort of
is
steno pad.
old-fashioned steno pad with the Bic, what is this called? Flair, whatever pen. I have to have these pens. I have to have a steno notebook. I've had many people I've worked with over the years being like, you have to get that's something that looks prettier for meetings. This is embarrassing. And I'm like, but I have a system and it works for me. And I really am old school and believe that, like, when I physically cross something off, when I physically write it down, it's in my brain. So I swear by the fact that this is one of my secrets to success. But again, I show my age. You can probably do it on a computer now, but that's something that just I can't change.
Well, let's end on a recommendation from you, and this can be comfort food. It doesn't have to be anything too weighty or substantial, but what is something, a book, a TV show, a movie, a recipe, a product, something you've gotten into recently that you'd recommend people give a try?
I love TVs and movies and books. I'm a huge book person. I read, track my reading on Goodreads. I read, I think my goal is 40 books this year, mysteries and rom-coms, and the lighter fare. I do read, my share of political books too, but sometimes I just like a break for them. So I've recently discovered, well, here's a book I really loved recently, which was actually not a fiction, but it was The Life of Mama Love, which was a biography about a woman who was a suburban mom, went to jail for drugs, and had to turn her life around. And it was a really inspiring and lovely book. And I just finished that recently, and I really loved it.
From Capitol Hill to big national think tanks to now founding and working at NewDEAL, focused on state and local level leaders, Debbie Cox Bultan, thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much, Jack. It was really a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Pro Politics Podcast. Please subscribe so you can access each episode first thing every Tuesday morning. And if you're so inclined, leave a rating and a short review on your podcast app to help more people find this podcast. And follow us on Twitter and Facebook for updates on upcoming guests. Thanks for listening.